All right, folks, so today we're going to be discussing a supplement that has been around for quite some time. Most folks are familiar with it, but I still see a number of questions on it daily. The substance we're talking about today is creatine, and most of you are quite familiar with it. It's probably one of the most common dietary supplements, certainly sports supplements in the industry. And when it first came out, there were, you're talking about 20 years ago, there were a number of safety concerns, efficacy concerns, etc., most of which seem to have been put to rest. It's estimated probably close to 60% of athletes have at some point taken creatine in their athletic careers, with at any given point, I think the number seems relatively low. About 14% of all Olympians and other high-level athletes are taking it at once. So that's pretty significant. So long story short, creatine, generally well known, well tolerated, but let's find out some of the details on it. First of all, as you can see, the scope of the presentation is going to be what is it, how is it taken, benefits, different types of training, and one of the most interesting segments we're going to talk about is the potential cognitive and neuroprotective benefits. We'll also get into a quick discussion of potential risks or side effects, as well as how to properly dose it. So everything you need to know about creatine. So what is creatine? It is actually the combination of two amino acids. As you can see, it's synthesized about 1 gram per day in the average male, a little bit lower in the average female. Obviously, larger people produce more, smaller people produce less. It is, as we say, naturally occurring. It is found in high quantities in red meat, also found in most other kinds of meat. Again, levels tend to be a little bit lower in vegetarians and vegans because of this. It is naturally produced in your liver and kidneys. It has its own transporter outside cells, the CRT1. There are also CRT2 transporters that are found in the testes. We don't really need to discuss those particularly. There's a compound. Now, creatine itself is used to, as we kind of know, it is used to replenish ATP in muscle cells. Actually, in fact, in all cells. ATP, as we know, is the universal currency, a high energy phosphate donor that is used to catalyze most active reactions. It is pretty much the universal energy source. Creatine phosphate, or PCR, is basically creatine itself, that molecule with a phosphate bound to it. And basically in the process of sticking a phosphate onto the creatine, then what happens is when ATP is converted to ADP and is depleted of phosphate, in other words, it becomes less effective, creatine PCR pops around, donates the phosphate back, and replenishes ATP. It is typically seen as that short-term gas tank, but as we know, or as we will find out, the fact that a reaction takes place in the short term, the fact that this is considered a short-term energy source, does not mean that it is not being continuously replenished even at low levels of intensity. The creatine phosphate system is critically important for a lot of processes in the body, ranging from short-term energy, short-term muscular contraction. It is used in, cell division. It is used by neurons. It is used in the case of trauma. It is used by cells in so many cases, which is probably why we're finding more and more potential benefits to creatine. So creatinine is a byproduct of it. It is an irreversible conversion over time. That is typically how it is excreted, and you can usually find it in the urine when you get a blood panel done or a kidney panel done. You'll typically see the byproduct of it as a normal indicator of kidney function, breakdown, etc. Note that elevated levels of this byproduct are very common if you're taking supplemental creatine. It is usually nothing to worry about. We can discuss that a little bit more. So basically, what is it? It is a short-term resupplier for your energy tank. How is it taken? There are multiple oral forms, as you can see. We all know creatine monohydrate. There's creatine ethyl ester, citrate malate, phosphate gluconate, and a bunch of other ones. A lot of these other ones have been developed for various reasons. In many cases, people like finding proprietary blends of things so they can sell them, put a label on them, and sell them for 10 times the cost. There are also cases where a lot of these different delivery methods are purported to deliver creatine faster, deliver it with less GI upset, raise levels faster. As we can see, most of those are not actually true. Very few changes to availability within muscle tissue, and as we'll see in the side effects section, very little difference with most of those. It is important to note that transdermal applications, as have been proposed, are ineffective. It is not well absorbed through skin or any other membranes. Loading phase, which we'll talk about, results in more rapid concentrations, but is not necessarily superior. Now, One of the things that people talk about is, well, what if I'm a creatine non-responder? Anywhere between 20 and 30% of people who take dietary creatine think that they are non-responders. As such, they try different loading protocols, different delivery methods, etc. In many cases, these are simply individuals who either have inherently higher levels or they have a lower percentage of lean body mass or concentration percentage of type 2 fibers. They are not non-responders, they are simply low responders and may need to take slightly more over time and or build more muscle mass before they notice a difference. It is important to note, liquid preparations and other delivery methods show no superiority. Some people may be familiar with super creatine, which is a compound found in a popular energy drink. It doesn't actually result in an increase in creatine stores. There's certainly trial data showing certain energy drinks that result in superior IGF-1 release and everything else, and these companies will use this as a way to market their super creatine. However, they don't control for other compounds in the energy drink like beta-alanine, which is a known ergogenic aid that can increase exercise intensity, increase the amount of work capacity, etc., which can all result in better adaptation. So ignore super creatine, ignore liquid preparations. So what are the actual benefits to this compound? Well, the main one we know about, benefits to anaerobic or strength training. If you think about it, the fundamental value, providing more immediate high-energy phosphates to replenish ATP, what does that mean? It means in the short term, if you are engaged in a lift, any sort of repetition, high-intensity motion, low repetition, high-intensity motion, typically the depletion of ATP is what really triggers a lot of other energy systems to kick in and try to get energy back. Of course, in most cases at the intensity done in weightlifting, you cannot replenish ATP fast enough via these other energy systems to actually produce more work. That is where the PCR system comes in. That is why having more PCR, more high energy phosphates means that you can do more work in the short term before you get fatigued. The benefit to anaerobic strength training is obvious from that. Greater workload, greater stimulus in training, you get more complete actual fatigue of motor units. In other words, every set you do is going to be more effective because you're actually forcing the muscles to do more work. Faster speed of contraction, more complete contractions, greater responsiveness of motor units during repeat bout activity. In other words, say you're sprinting. Rather than having all of those muscle fibers start to get fatigued but also get low in energy levels, the fact that the creatine is replenishing ATP faster means that you are going to have more contractions at high quality, possibly allowing for things like better strength, better sprint performance. And if you think about it, all else being equal, if you have one athlete who's able to do 10% more productive work by the time they get to competition as the athlete sitting next to them, that athlete is probably going to be better off. They're going to have more muscular stimulus, they're going to have more training, better motor learning, all of those kind of things, as we could say, superior for skill acquisition, training quality, developing coordination. Do more work, elicit more muscular fatigue as opposed to simply substrate fatigue, more muscular tension overall, you're going to build more strength, build more coordination. It does improve your output by about 10% in performance bouts lasting less than 30 seconds, which is absolutely profound. Now, this doesn't mean you're going to sprint 10% faster because there's a lot more to sprint performance than simply output, but it will improve your overall work capacity. Now, there are second order effects, which we're going to discuss in a little bit. It may actually improve your recovery and reduce your likelihood of overtraining. Okay, so far sounds good. How about for aerobic training? Well, there is a little bit less evidence for direct benefits to aerobic training. In other words, it's probably not going to make you faster as an ultra runner. There's some conflicting data on an increase in your lactate threshold. In other words, if you're kind of a miler or mid-distance runner, there's some evidence in some studies that it improves your lactate threshold. Other studies show no improvement whatsoever. Second order benefits are pretty profound though. We're talking about faster recovery between sprints or high energy output intervals. If you are a cyclist, if you are a criterium racer, if you are doing climbs, sprints, surges, if you're a runner doing hill runs, if you're a runner looking for a last surge at the end of a race, if you're jockeying for position or anything else, your ability to recover quickly between those efforts can be absolutely crucial. Now, we're talking about distances where overall energy management is less of a concern than short-term performance. That is important to note because, again, you only have a fixed amount of energy. All this is doing is letting you replenish it faster because the phosphate in creatine, that energy needs to come from somewhere. When you use those creatine phosphate stores, that creatine phosphate gets its phosphate back via other methods. In other words, creatine provides a second energy tank in the short term, but you still have to refill that energy tank in between efforts to actually make use of it again. You refill that through aerobic methods, you refuel that through glycolysis, you refuel that through all those other methods, so your overall energy levels aren't increased, just your ability to use them in the short term is. However, there is a potential ability to extend glycogen stores. Again, remember, if you are tapping into that creatine phosphate just a little bit longer, you are potentially less likely to dip into the early stages of lactate production or anaerobic fermentation. If you are doing a 30-second sprint or 30-second climb, and that creatine system is lasting you just a little bit longer than the person next to you, they're dipping into that lactate system. They are converting more glucose to lactate, which generates less energy per gram of glucose than you are. So there's a potential that if used judiciously, you may be able to extend your glycogen stores a little bit longer through the use of creatine. There's also potential benefits to thermoregulation. A lot of studies were done when creatine first came out, and people would experience muscle cramping, or so they said, where there was a theory that creatine actually reduced your ability to stay hydrated. Turns out a lot of those studies found the opposite. So they also then decided to test, well, are people overheating because they take creatine? Most studies found no difference. The ones that did find a difference in thermoregulation between creatine users and non-creatine users found that creatine users actually exhibited superior thermoregulation. In other words, they were better able to control their body temperature. So, for the most part, benefits to aerobic training are second and third order. In other words, not direct performance, but related to performance. Remember, we also talked about potential recovery, skill acquisition, all those other things that aerobic athletes need as well that they may be beneficial for. So now we get into some of the other interesting stuff. Benefits to hypertrophy, lean mass gain, and retention. Well, there are proposed mechanisms beyond simply being able to do more work, which we're going to talk about at the bottom. There is evidence that there is enhanced expression of certain components of the mTOR pathway, the mammalian target of rapamycin, which is typically known as one of the chief anabolic pathways or master pathways. There is some evidence that administration of creatine directly upregulates certain steps in that pathway. It's also the theory that creatine, by virtue of the fact that it causes greater cellular fluid retention, results in greater cell swelling, which is debatably an overall anabolic signal to cells. In other words, cells swelling themselves may actually signal certain growth processes, or at least indicate to the cell that it is ready for growth and primed for growth. Of course, a lot of that is still under discussion. It can also potentially alter both your IGF-1 and myostatin levels. Insulin-like growth factor 1, which is a primary, as the name implies, it is a primary growth factor, especially in muscle growth, and it may reduce myostatin levels. As we know, myostatin is a muscle growth inhibitor. So creatine may very well be directly responsible for affecting these two areas, and we're going to talk about why in just a minute. Also, apparently enhanced satellite cell differentiation. Satellite cells, as we know, are the sort of non-differentiated cells around muscle cells, really around most tissues, but around muscle cells especially, that when properly activated, begin to donate their nuclei and also eventually effectively become a, quote, cell donor to increase the size and strength of existing muscle cells. Also, interesting here, appears that there is a marked reduction in damage and damage markers in athletes who are using creatine. And again, we're going to talk about that in just a second, because there's also a reduction in certain inflammatory or markers of apoptosis, which includes certain proteins. So, why is this? What does all this mean? Well, one way to think about it is this. When a cell is typically under stress, when a cell reaches low energy levels, typically speaking, this is much more of a catabolic signal to the cell itself. Remember, phosphocreatine system and ATP levels are not just controlling muscular contraction, they are responsible for the action of a lot of other processes in the cell. If a cell is in a fed state with high ATP levels, in fact, high ATP levels can be an indicator for a number of different processes, growth processes to take place. If a cell has high levels of ATP, high levels of energy stores, typically it tends to shift into much more of an anabolic state. Protein production, protein incorporation, development of certain structures. If cell energy levels are low, typically that indicates to the body in general that it is in a starved state, and catabolic processes are much more likely to take place. Certain self-cleaning processes that are meant to free up proteins for the rest of the body to use start to take place, start to dominate. So if a cell detects that it's low in energy, it is much more likely to engage in several catabolic processes. Whereas if it detects that it is high in energy, it is much more likely to maintain its integrity and or signal greater growth. So we can see how taking more creatine and increasing phosphocreatine stores means that ATP levels will typically stay higher in cells and they will stay in a generally more anabolic state. Also interesting that when muscle cells contract repeatedly, eventually what starts to happen when performance degrades is more calcium ends up outside the muscle cells. There are a number of proteases, which are protein degrading enzymes, which are actually triggered by high levels of calcium in the bloodstream. So very interesting set of processes that take place here, that the simple fact that creatine keeps your ATP levels higher may actually mitigate. So it may directly be able to cause muscle growth, or at the very least, reduce swelling, inflammation, damage, and destructive processes after training. And again, beyond mechanistic, faster recovery, you're allowed to achieve a greater stimulus because you're actually able to do more work, a greater activation of entire motor pool, all those things we look for in resistance training to improve the quality of each workout and elicit a greater growth stimulus creatine lets you do. All right, well, how about neuroprotective or cognitive benefits we've talked about? This is a massive, massive area of research, and it is way outside the scope of this presentation, but we can talk about a few items here and overall purported mechanisms. So first of all, performance in tasks. We're talking about higher executive task functions. That's short-term memory, reasoning, all kinds of things. It is absolutely improved post-creatine administration, especially when fatigued. It is likely that there are issues with creatine, with energy levels, with a lot of higher executive functions, especially in the neurons, when creatine levels are low, and we'll talk about those in a minute. So if you are at least somewhat chronically fatigued, like many of us are, the fact that you're taking creatine itself may somewhat attenuate that level of fatigue and allow us to maintain a greater degree of focus and short-term memory while we're taking it. That can be a massive advantage, not just in life in general, especially in the regular life of us non-professional athletes, but also in athletics itself. Anytime you need quick decision making, anytime you're looking to improve skill acquisition, for example, sport movements, high skill sport movements, even something like Olympic weightlifting. So there's a potential benefit. Here's another one: reduction in age and disease related decline. So, age and disease, we see a decrease in energy production in cells overall, especially neurons, which can interrupt a lot of the antioxidative processes, a lot of the processes that reduce cellular degradation, degradation of certain components. Oxidative stress over time, especially during aging, causes degradation of a lot of different systems, production, structural integrity of proteins, collagen, myelin, all those other things. Accumulation of intercellular calcium, as we talked about, which is one thing that creatine attenuates, can actually be a degrading signal or degradation signal for a lot of different cellular structures. Taking creatine has shown some benefit in reducing age and disease-related neurological decline, and we'll talk about in the very next section here. Another thing, protection from excitotoxicity. Excitotoxicity, we're talking about overstimulation of the glutamate receptor, etc. Basically, excitotoxicity is a major factor in cellular and neuron damage in traumatic brain injury, spinal cord injury, ALS, multiple sclerosis, Alzheimer's, many other both trauma and age-related diseases, including those with a genetic component. Being able to essentially, now one of the theories is that, again, the CA2 scavenging and the reduction in intracellular calcium levels, typically in these diseases, we do see some issues with the creatine formation, creatine processing, and creatine retention over time. Introduction of exogenous creatine or supplementing with creatine shows signs of actually reversing this degradation, removing CA2 plus from the bloodstream in the area in between receptors, which can actually reduce excitotoxic reactions. In other words, it can actually reduce the amount of damage inflicted after, say, TBIs or injury, or on a regular basis with degenerative neurological disease. This is, of course, under great study, but it would appear that this holds true pretty much across the board, which has, again, some, tremendous implications here. What is the overall theory here that we're talking about, though? When we talk about everything from hypertrophy, neuroprotective cognitive benefits, we all keep coming back to the same idea, which is that maintaining cells in a higher energy state allows them to effectively function more efficiently and are less likely to put themselves in catabolic or destructive states. So regardless of the mechanism, it could be the simple fact that cells have more energy in them and are in a greater anabolic state, that they are better able to carry out certain tasks, including antioxidant tasks, less likely to suffer damage, less likely to secrete pro-inflammatory markers, less likely to pretty much destroy themselves. So it sounds brilliant. Well, what about the potential risks or side effects? First of all, the one everyone asks me about: hair loss. No, false. There was a single study where it was administered where those taking creatine showed higher DHT levels. It was never duplicated, and hair loss wasn't even observed. They simply observed higher DHT levels. That could be simply because the individuals taking creatine were able to train harder, potentially had some small uptick in testosterone levels, which of course means higher levels of DHT. So that one's false. Kidney damage. Well, we've observed some cases of that in individuals with existing renal disease. We're talking about very sick people. They should probably not take creatine. The only downside, if you're otherwise healthy, is that, again, since your creatinine levels will show as higher, typically those levels are shown as a marker of kidney issues. The higher levels of creatinine don't mean that you have kidney issues. It's simply a marker of kidney issues. So if you're taking exogenous creatine, be aware that you may have higher creatinine levels. That doesn't mean that they're not also elevated due to kidney issues. So you should probably rule that out. And if you're going in for a blood panel, don't take creatine for about 4 or 5 days beforehand. Let those levels return to normal, and don't unintentionally mask something that might be very critical. Dehydration. Well, we discussed that. All the theories on hydration confirmed, all the tests confirmed no change in fluid or hydration status. There's even some evidence that it aids in hydration and aids in thermoregulation. So that is not an issue. Bear in mind, a lot of this holds true for cramping as well. There's no direct evidence that creatine itself causes cramping. Some of the difference may simply be due to the different amount of work that an individual can do. Remember, the majority of cramping actually comes from stress, and it comes from neurologically mediated balance between both the contraction and the relaxation signals within a muscle, the muscle spindle, Golgi tendon apparatus, etc. Oh, sorry, not Golgi tendon apparatus, Golgi tendon reflex. What that basically means is that it's a disruption in electrical signals, usually caused by muscular fatigue or overuse, specifically that results in cramping. Creatine, by virtue of the fact that it's going to allow higher output, may result in a certain degree of overstimulation to the muscles that may lead to cramping. Increase in body weight. This one is true. Between 1 and 1.5% of total body weight is typically observed. The only time I would say this would be a major problem would be if the potential benefits to power output do not outweigh the change in body weight. If you are a cyclist or a runner engaged in regular activity or engaged in races of longer than about 3 or 4 hours with a lot of hills in them, you might want to lay off the creatine during competition time. By all means, use it for the training, use it for skill acquisition, use it for benefits to thermoregulation, recovery, potentially protecting against nerve injury or TBI can always be good, especially if you're a trail runner or mountain biker, for obvious reasons. Yeah, there you go. Now, dosing recommendations. No need for a loading phase. 3 to 5 grams are well tolerated. Non-responders, quote unquote, may need to take slightly more to really see an effect. Form taken, again, no evidence for really efficacy or additional risks with any of the other forms. Again, there is not going to be any difference in weight gain. People say, well, no bloat. Well, the only bloat some people get from creatine monohydrate that is caused by the administration form is gastrointestinal distress. There may be some forms that sit a little bit better. That doesn't mean they're not causing weight gain. It just means you're not noticing stomach upset. So yeah, avoid liquid or transdermal. There is no need to cycle. Typically, people cycle off compounds when certain receptors downregulate. The idea is that if your body senses that there's a lot of this compound, it reduces the number or availability of receptors responsible for incorporating whatever the compound is into cells or into the bloodstream. Creatine transporters do not downregulate. No matter how much you take, your body is not going to try to compensate for it by reducing endogenous production or reducing number of transporters or anything else. So there is no need to cycle. Also, there are very few drug interactions. Please do note if you're taking high doses of nephrotoxic drugs like NSAIDs or any sort of prescription medication, you may wish to exercise caution temporarily. If you have a major injury or something, or you've just had surgery or anything similar and you've been prescribed large doses of ibuprofen, you may want to consider not taking creatine at that time. Otherwise, it's generally well tolerated. Hopefully this was interesting. I know there's a lot of material here. There is a tremendous amount on possible issues and possible prevention of cognitive decline and neurological disease, etc. This should give an overview. We will probably be discussing this more in the education portal. If you're a member there, great. If not, be sure to sign up. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.